Ladies and gentlemen, please join us in welcoming our next session to stage.
Hey everybody, I'm not the next session, but I am Zach Seward. I am the MC of Protocol Village today. We've had some nice topics so far. We had sort of the developer report update, we had interoperability, we had account abstraction, we had data indexing. Now we're going to spice it up a little bit. I'm pretty pumped for this next topic. We're going to be talking about CBDCs. That stands for Central Bank Digital Currencies, which are rapidly approaching in many a country near and far. All right, so if these things are kind of inevitable, maybe it makes sense for like real crypto people to be at the table and building out their tech stack, right? So that's what one firm is doing. It's called Kaleido. They've been a Web3 firm for a long time now, working in the enterprise, Ethereum space, and more. Multi-chain approach, pretty cool. We have co-founder Sophia Lopez, who's going to come up and talk about the CBDC tech stack and how you folks in this room can get involved in shaping the future of CBDCs. Going to be a good one. Please welcome Sophia to the stage. Here she is.
Yep, thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be back here on stage. We've been involved with the Consensus event for many years now. Actually did our initial launch, so it's exciting to be here. And I'm very excited that they have a Protocol Village this year, really focusing on developers and builders. So focusing on the tech as well as policy and industry trends, as they always do. So a little bit about me. I think just going to the next slide. And the next one. So I'm one of the founders of Kaleido. We've been in the Web3 space for almost 6 years now, and we were founded, started Kaleido with a co-founder, really to make Web3 and digital assets radically simple to use and for enterprise use cases. I think there's a lot of talk about making it easier for users. This is important. For users to be able to onboard to Web3. And we really, initially started looking at how could we get developers to onboard more easily, including people who have a very strong Web 2 background, but are not really as skilled up on Web 3 yet. We really informed our perspective back in 2015 when we were at the IBM side of the house and launched the first blockchain as a service in the industry, which was IBM Blockchain Platform. Worked with hundreds of clients the first 2 years in that journey, and really saw people needed a lot of help on really understanding what tech stack to use, getting onboarded, and wanted to help build something from the ground up to help address that. So some of you probably are pretty familiar with CBDCs, but I thought there might be maybe a curious person who just wandered in. Zach did a good job of actually defining what CBDCs are, but central bank digital currencies. And the Atlantic Council puts out a great tracker, which some of you might have seen as well. But I think it's worth just stating over 100 countries are actively involved. About 70 are in research and development phases. They're considering about 11 launched, and then there's about 18 in pilot. A few have been canceled or are inactive. So you can see there's a lot of activity in the space going back for a number of years. Technically, I guess the first CBDC happened 3 decades ago, but it's really with cryptocurrencies and blockchain that there's this renewed interest by governments and really looking at removing a lot of pain point and frictions. I think more overall, the thought that came to my mind was a quote by Victor Hugo: "There's nothing more powerful than idea whose time has come." And you could see that with this groundswell of different projects and interests really across the globe. So I think with all of this work underway, some reflections on what does it take for these projects to be successful and to create these new platforms. So there's really, 3 levels of challenges. You look at, just starting at the business challenge, and there's very active conversation in some countries about this. What does it mean? Regulatory, there's compliance implications. There's certainly a lot of people looking to understand more just as citizens, how does this impact them, and then what could be potential benefits. Then you're really looking at, so that's the business layer, and this is common for any Web3 project. There's really 3 layers you need to worry about. There's a business layer, there's this shared IT layer where there's legacy processes, there's a way people are doing things today, there's existing systems and sources of data. So how do you build the new products or services on top of those that'll integrate, really meeting the way the world works, where it is today, and bringing that into the future. And that can be pretty tough, especially when you have multiple parties who are exchanging data, and things need to interoperate. So there's a lot of talk about that, obviously, just more generally in the Web3 space on the interop side. And then if you get down into the actual tech itself, there's a lot of things for people to learn. In the early days of blockchain, we were still talking to a lot of banks, financial services clients, just why go to the cloud? And this is back 2015, 2016. So people were at a certain journey in terms of digital transformation, in terms of moving to the cloud. A lot of these systems have been around for decades. So really, concrete's been poured in certain foundations. And when you're going to make this sort of change, you need to be pretty thoughtful about it. And then, just the Web3 tech itself has new programming languages, new frameworks, P2P protocols that can be pretty daunting when you're trying to achieve more of a mass scale and onboard. So what we really found across all projects is there was a Gen 1 way of solving these problems that might start with a blockchain node, and then that. Even the managed service for that helps you with 5% of the project, or 5 to 10%. Really, the remainder of the stack was being custom built out time and time again. And that could mean you were, 3 to 5 years to build a project out, one use case, tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of thousand lines of code. And I think in the last 6 months, we've seen some of those projects which had been long running actually close shop, fold down. One example was the Australian Stock Exchange, $250 million write-off, and I believe it was 6 or 7 years into building. So, that prompts the question of, well, what did we learn from that Gen 1 approach, where it just would take so long to get to business value that it would be hard to get the ROI? And then, what are learnings as you're really trying to move above just rebuilding the plumbing layer over and over again at each project and spending all your time and effort and focus there? And what could it look like if you really focus on the business value and what the ecosystem needs to do to understand how to use these technologies? So what we're seeing now across all of Web3 is really a movement to more of a full stack approach, really looking at plug-and-play components that developers can leverage and reuse, things that open source communities are driving. They're very scalable, pluggable, hardened. You have all sorts of projects using them across all industries. And I did neglect to mention earlier, Kaleido is a horizontal platform, basically like an AWS, but for Web3 and working across all industries. So we certainly have the perspective of seeing how this is happening at scale in very highly regulated industries, performant compliant type projects, moving to really a Gen 2 approach to building. I think what's exciting is here at the event itself, there's a couple days of talks with some of these communities and code bases that you can interact with afterwards, and I'll point you to that as well. But you look, there's 2 sides of the equation. The enterprises or the organizations, the governments who are building, they might have a dozen different things they're trying to do. And it could be a constellation of different types of projects for where they're participating in someone else's Web3 project or ecosystem. They might be launching something internally. And they might be a solution provider who's building something new. So how can they have that new system of record that could manage state across all of that, sort of track value? A lot of these projects might have digital assets, and also integrate into their back-end systems, as I mentioned earlier. And then, of course, there's all the infrastructure components you need to run as well. So we've talked to all sorts of companies, from banks to gaming companies. So gaming companies have come to us and said, there is 17 different pieces of Web3 tech I need to pick up, use, sign NDAs, integrate, and that's just really slowing us down getting to market. So these are common problems across all the Web3 projects, and especially for CBDCs, we see the same pattern. And I would say they're a special case of what we're seeing more generally across people who are building solutions. So they're more specifically diving into just the tech stack. You can see some common patterns across the different projects, and I mentioned about 70% are really more in an R&D phase. So people are standing up regulated sandboxes. They realize that this is really something that they need to work with all the right counterparties. They need to experiment. They need to get to where they're working on the use cases, whether that's wholesale or retail or both, and letting the market participants and stakeholders inform what they're doing. So they need to stand up a very compliant infrastructure that central banks can use. In a time frame where they have the stakeholder engagement, they can get to the business conversations and not spend years up front just coding the plumbing layers. So just looking more generally at what we're seeing, there is definitely, in the old days, we called this middleware layer at the heart, where you're looking at, events. Blockchain's a very event-driven system. Data, it's APIs, so RESTful APIs that Web2 developers can use and build applications on top of. Managing keys, and key management's obviously a very important topic in the Web3 space. And then connectors to different, ledgers, blockchains. And on top of that sort of core middleware engine, there's integrating to the systems that might be particular to that CBDC ecosystem, what they're trying to prove out, an UI layer, reporting, and then business functions and as part of the governance. So we see different types of approaches with the banks and large institutional partners, and we do, feel EVM is very well suited for these types of projects, so Ethereum-based or EVM standard, because they can work across both the private and public chains. And some banking and CBDC projects are also looking at options such as Fabric and Corda as well. On the EVM side, certainly there's a lot of thinking about how to interact with open ecosystems and the innovation that could happen, and then just the role of intermediated CBDC options and how that would the user experience or how you're going to interact in a particular country ecosystem. So certainly when you're looking at EVM-based chains, you're looking at permissions and firewalls, blockchain explorers, RPC gateways as well. So to give an example of really this Gen 2 approach of getting to market quickly and really helping banks come together to understand and explore what they can do. A great example is what Swift did. Really began in the beginning of last summer. Couple of weeks, they had the fully regulated CBDC infrastructure up, SOC 2 Type 2 compliant, ISO 27K, all of that. And we're ready to start talking to banks about onboarding. Then you had a mix, 18 central banks and global transaction banks were able to work together over a 12-week period on both wholesale and retail use cases. And Swift was really looking at tackling the problem of, if you have 100+ country ecosystems, exploring or looking to launch or launching CBDCs, you're going to create a lot of fragmentation or potentially, digital islands or silos. And what could their role be in the future, moving past messaging, to actually help be a gateway to interoperability between these ecosystems? And of course, since they're a nonprofit of the banks, when they do something like this, there's an open invitation to participate. 18 people signed on board for that, and it was able to move, extremely quickly compared to the Gen 1 approach, which, is years and could be very heavyweight, not just in terms of cost, but just internal resources as well. They did publish, they're continually publishing white papers on what they're working on, so they have a great report that just came out, I guess about 2 or 3 weeks ago, just to share with everyone some of the learnings. I think they had about almost 5,000 transactions between the parties, regular syncs in terms of just knowledge sharing across the use cases that they were tackling. And I did include, just again, since this is meant to be more of looking at the tech stack, a high-level component view of what they were looking to do. So they actually chose to model 2 different protocol options or ledger options. So one Ethereum-based one, as well as Corda. In their white paper, they talk about, Hyperledger Fabric is one that had been requested by some of their members. So they're looking at adding that in the next phase, potentially. And then modeling that, interoperating against a real-time gross settlement system. So really being able to model out some of the interoperability. A lot of times people ask, if you're building on one blockchain, then you're going to get a world of blockchains, and how is this all going to work together? So it was great for them to be able to prove that out. And really that decentralized middleware that I had mentioned earlier was key to making sure things like private messaging or some of the aspects of privacy could be handled as part of this. Another good example of this next-gen approach is one that's currently happening in Australia as well. So they were able to very quickly stand up this pilot. They actually just announced in March 15 different use cases. And again, they're tackling or opening it up to both wholesale and retail, and then letting all the industry participants decide what they would want to explore and what they're trying to prove out, and share the results with others in the ecosystem. So some of the takeaways, I think I already covered, but it's just important. We're a little bit more in early stages still, especially with CBDCs, and that makes sense. It's pretty systemically important. We want to get it right, but we're going to get there by moving quickly into business use cases, business value, which is this Gen 2 approach to building. Most of the projects in regulated sandboxes, they're happening across different protocols and chains. And you really need to think about both permissions, or like private blockchains, as well as public. As I mentioned, EVM is a great fit for both of those. And the middleware ends up being what can really accelerate a project and give you the sort of hardened plug-and-play modules to really move quickly with what you're trying to do from a business outcomes perspective. So I did, since this is meant to be focused more at developers, I did want to showcase, this is what I mentioned earlier, that the Hyperledger, who's a Web3 focused foundation that sits under the Linux Foundation. The Linux Foundation actually runs 90% of the open, or owns 90%. The Linux Foundation holds, I guess is a better term, the code for 90% of what enterprises run in production that's open source, and those are all governed by communities, the respective code communities. So Hyperledger is a part of that. Hyperledger Firefly has been used in a number of these CBDC projects, and 750,000 lines of code. You could get started today. There's a bunch of talks on more details you could get at the booth, which is, I think, booth 312 and 313. But really looking at, solving problems around, best patterns and practices around event-driven systems. How do you integrate, get data onto the chain, get data off of the chain, and deal with token assets, look at the DevOps and BizOps aspects and security, identity. So really solving a lot of the problems around the just onboarding and scaling from Web 2 to Web 3. And the benefits of that is you can build faster, reduce costs. In the early days, a lot of times just adding new members became a big problem because these networks were very brittle. And if it takes you 6 months to a year to onboard a new member, you're probably going to have trouble with momentum on the project. Streamlining a lot of the workflows, IT governance and ops, and doing that in a secure, compliant, and scalable way. So that concludes, I guess, the quick point of view on what we're seeing in terms of a tech stack in the CBDC space. I'm happy to talk more about it at different sessions at the Hyperledger booth during the week. So thanks, everyone.